For Edmonton, Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Finance admitted to the Canadian people in his fall economic statement yesterday that his ideas just aren't working. That isn't what he said, but it was what Canadians understood. GDP growth is lower than he expected in his March budget. He plans another $31.8 billion in borrowing over the next 5 years. This is a fantasy number, given the original promise was to run a modest deficit of $10 billion annually. What he was really saying is that he plans to keep throwing taxpayers' money at the economy, because eventually something good may happen if they spend enough. Such an attitude has not worked in the past, but I guess the Minister of Finance has never learned that those who do not learn from the mistakes of history are doomed to repeat it. As the Canadian debt numbers increase, the government hopes that somehow people won't notice. The Minister of Finance needs to tell Canadians what taxes he will hike and which programs he will cut to fund these expensive new promises. The Minister of Finance still has no plan to balance the budget, and the Liberals have no idea how to get Canadians back to work. Given the gentleman's background in business before he entered political life, I am somewhat surprised that he is not more embarrassed at such a deficit financing, especially with no plan to turn things around. I can only surmise that he is also a student of history and understands the Liberal governments are only good at one thing: spending money that doesn't belong to them. In March, this government was full of high praise for its budget. 8 months later, that praise seemed more wishful thinking than reality. According to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, job growth over the past year was half the average of the previous 5 years. There has been a drop in the number of full-time jobs. The PBO says that under this government, the Canadian economy has failed to create one new full-time job. That is a sad record. The Prime Minister promised Canadians that if he borrowed billions of dollars, he would create jobs and grow the economy. Now they're full of excuses. Canadians must miss the fine print. Borrowing billions hasn't created any jobs so far. A logical person would look at that record and conclude that approach does not work. A rational person would look for an alternative that would help get Canadians back to work. The Minister of Finance is borrowing more money, sinking the government and the people further into debt under a spending program that has already been shown not to work. That suggests to me that he really has no idea what to do to create jobs. Mr. Speaker, the Minister has announced changes to the Canada Pension Plan. This expansion will cost more than expected. Internal documents show that officials advised the Minister that higher CPP premiums will be a drag on the economy until 2030, and that the negative impact on jobs will last until 2035. The PPO expects the fiscal cost of the expansion to reach $825 million a year by 2021-2022 due to the tax deductibility of CPP premiums and increased spending on the working income tax credit. When these changes are introduced, Canadians will take home less paycheck each week. The government wants us to think that isn't much, that we will never notice it. But every penny less in a person's pocket makes a difference to that person. The Minister likes to think that increased CPP payments are not a tax, but money taken off your paycheck by the government is a tax. A promise to return it with interest some years later remains just a promise. This government is good at making promises. It has not shown itself to be as good on actually delivering on those promises. For example, They have promised a lot of money for infrastructure projects. This money, they say, will create jobs. Well, we all know there's no jobs. And there was no jobs have been created, so what has happened? According to Bloomberg, out of the 860 infrastructure projects approved by the Liberals so far, only one has actually broken ground. That is not a very impressive track record. I wonder why the government did not choose to fund the projects that were ready to proceed. Certainly, there was more than one infrastructure project being planned in Canada this year that could have been implemented by now. Mr. Speaker, the government is also introducing new rules on mortgages that will make it harder for Canadians to buy a home. The Bank of Canada says that these new housing rules will cost the economy $6 billion by the end of 2018. The role of government should be to create a fiscal environment where businesses can create permanent jobs for the people of Canada. The government should not be introducing measures after measure that restricts economic growth and costs people their jobs. That would seem to be simple economics, but a grasp of what that escaped the Liberals spending billions of taxpayers' dollars with no result doesn't make sense. You can't spend your way to growth as you can't spend your tax. You can't tax your way to prosperity. What is needed is an economic plan, not a politically motivated and hastily conceived piece of legislation. These changes, by increasing government debt, will negatively impact all Canadians. The results of the past year are dismal. We don't trust the Liberals to deliver results, and increasingly, neither do Canadians. Not only that their plan has failed, Liberal tax hikes and red tape are making things worse. First, they cancel family tax credit for sports and art classes and cancel small business tax cuts. Now they are imposing a CPP tax hike and carbon tax that will cost families thousands of dollars every year. The Liberals' only solution to those problems seems to be to borrow and spend even more money, money that will have to be paid back by Canadian workers and families and job creators. Conservatives understand that when you borrow money, you need to pay it back with interest. That's why we are careful not only with our own money, but with that entrusted to us by the taxpayers. I only wish Liberals felt the same way and had respect for Canadian taxpayers. This bill implements measures from a budget that lacks concrete, targeted plan to stimulate economic innovation. In effect, it ignores the pressing need to develop these initiatives. The government doesn't seem to know where it's going and how it will get there, but it plans to spend a lot of money along the road. The lack of transparency surrounding the long-term costs of the Liberal economic policy is cause for serious concern. Canadians have the right to know how the government's fiscal plan, or lack of it, impacts them and the country. This is not about the present. It is about the future of Canada. As custodians of the taxpayers' hard-earned funds, it is our responsibility to act responsibly, not recklessly, with the nation's finances. As the government moves deeper and deeper into deficit, and the national debt grows increasingly larger, someone at some point will be called upon to foot the bill. When our children and grandchildren are struggling to maintain essential services and climb out from under a mountain of government debt, they will be asking why we failed to act in an irresponsible fashion. What we will tell them? That we truly believe budgets could balance themselves. The Liberal economic plan has failed, and Canadians are paying for it. When it comes to managing the economy, you don't get a second chance. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And maybe what I would like to do is just maybe contradict what it is that the member is saying, in the sense that we need to realize that what we have seen is a very aggressive, progressive government in the last year take an approach that is truly different. Canadians wanted real change because they saw a conservative government lose touch with what Canadians were thinking. And when we saw the re-election of our the election of our government, what we saw was substantial change, real change, I would argue. We saw increase in taxes for Canada's wealthiest to help compensate the middle-class tax cut. We saw the Canada Child Benefit Program, which will literally lift thousands of children out of poverty. We saw the Guaranteed Income Supplement have a substantial increase for single seniors. Some of the poorest seniors in every region of our country will get $900 for more, for example, than they had received previously. We have the hugest, the most significant increase in infrastructure dollars and the sense of commitment, I believe $180 million over the next 11 years. Canadians wanted change, and they got real change. And this is the type of thing in which I believe is going to see Canada do well into the future. My question for the member is, would he not at the very least recognize that the Conservatives in fact did lose touch, and as a result of losing touch, now we're seeing a much more progressive attitude at trying to get Canada's economy on the right track?
Before I let the honourable member answer, I want to remind the honourable members that it is questions or comments. It doesn't have to be necessarily a question, just to clarify. The honourable member for Edmonton Manning.
Well, thank you very much. I didn't agree the members opposite to agree with me. As usual, I know he's going to contradict what I said. But isn't a heroic fact or act to borrow money and spend it on people and tell people that you're spending money on them coming out of their pocket? That's a bad management, and that's bad financing and bad economy. If anyone understands the basic of economies, understand when you borrow money, you need to pay it back, and when you didn't have the money, you don't spend the money, so you keep playing low when economic difficulties are in place in order to be able to manage the people's money, because that is your responsibility and our responsibility and everybody's responsibility in this country to make sure Canadians' money are not for grab by any politician in this country like this government is doing.
Questions and comments on la députée de Sherbrooke.
The honourable member for Sherbrooke. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. And I was wondering, in the case of this second Budget Implementation Act and the fiscal update, the economic update yesterday, considering the results that we've seen over the past year, the economy is not improving, there's no growth, there's no job growth. Does my colleague think the government is doubling down on a strategy that's not working, apparently? And is it a bit like what Einstein said, that the definition of insanity is trying the same thing again when it didn't work the first time? Does he share my opinion, our opinion, that this strategy isn't working and the government should perhaps consider changing it?
Well, thank you. Thanks to the honourable colleague for his question. I enjoy sitting or spending some time with him on the Finance Committee. That is exactly true, what he just said. Because if the plan is not working, so we have to be very quick in order to be able to change the plan to make it workable for Canadians. And if we go deeper and deeper, spending more money and throwing more money at something that is not working, that's the biggest insanity. And this is by any measures of economic standards and financial standards and business standards. It doesn't make sense. This government is going in the wrong direction, and we don't know other than the result is going to be devastating for every Canadian.